Hi, welcome back. This is Drewscape, and today we're going to talk more about comics. So in my previous videos about autobiographical comics, you probably know how to put together a story, you've got it all written out, and you're ready to start drawing it out. So how do you actually start putting that story into comic panels? And that's what we're going to talk about.
Is it just about putting pictures and speech bubbles in little boxes?
I found that there's actually more to that. So here I'll share some basic principles and what I look out for when I put the story into comic panels and start drawing it out.
To begin with, let's understand eye flow. For those of us who read in English, our eyes move across a page in this letter Z motion. So it moves from left to right and then downwards and then left to right again. So I take note of this when I plan my panels. So generally when we read comics, we read it in this motion too. The letter Z, left to right, downwards, left to right, downwards, left to right. And you'll notice that it is the same as when we read books with just text. Same motion. But here's where we find something interesting. Do you notice that there's a smaller space between the letters and a wider space between the lines?
This actually encourages me to read in the letter Z eye flow motion,
rather than downwards, which won't really make sense.
So anyway, I found that we can actually apply this spacing thing to comics as well to help readers read in the direction we want them to read. I put a smaller spacing between the side-by-side panels, just like kerning between letters, and a wider spacing when we go to the next line, like leading. This helps the reader read the panels in the right order. If there's no variation in spacing, some readers might actually read it this way, like how some Asian comics are read. I see this spacing thing being used in many comics out there, but not all. It's not mandatory, especially for simple paneling like this. Most people will still read it in the right sequence. But for more complicated paneling like this, I add narrow spacings between some panels and wider spacings between others, so the reader is really clear on which panels to read next. When I teach comic classes now and then, I notice that students tend to at first draw the panels really far from each other. Yeah, try not to do that because a spacing actually creates a pause between the panels. More on that later, but a really wide spacing will cause the reader to pause for longer than needed, and that will affect the pacing of your comic. What we want are small natural pauses, like I'm making small pauses as I'm talking. I noticed that this same eye flow motion also applies to things within a panel. Because we read from left to right, our eyes will encounter the person on the left first and then the right. So right now, it will seem like this guy goes, "Ah!" before the other person goes, "Boo." Yes? But if I flipped the scene to align with how our eyes flow, "Boo," then "Ah!" the scene flows a lot more naturally. So take note of this when you're placing objects in a panel. The eye flow motion also applies to dialogue. So how would you read this scene? I mean, at first glance, "What's your name?" or "Bob" first. Bob, right? I would have to reread it before I get it right, and that interferes with the flow of reading. Readers won't read it in the right sequence just because we put all the information there. We have to guide the reader. So what can we do about this panel? To make the picture flow with eye flow, I can flip it around. Reads better, yes? But what if I really needed Bob to be on the left? How do we make the guy in the red cap speak first? Looking at the eye flow motion, we can make use of this top to down motion. So we can do this, because we'll read the top and then the bottom dialogue after. Got it? Okay, easy, right? So thinking about eye flow, how would you arrange the dialogue bubbles if we needed them to talk in this particular order? Right, like this. And this is how my eye would flow through the scene. Or I could even do it like this. And here's the eye flow. I find it's okay to cover over parts of a picture or a body if it isn't that important for that particular scene. I also use eye flow to determine where I place my narration text. What's a narration text? It's the text where the narrator talks over a scene. So this is me talking, "We feed Toby's medicine, blah blah blah," and then the scene plays out in pictures. And what I want to point out is, because of our natural eye flow, if I place the narration text on top of the picture, it means readers read it first, and it will also seem that what happens in that narration text happens first before the picture. Just for fun, let's just see how it reads if we position the text below. Does it make a difference? Yeah, it would feel like in terms of sequence, things are in the wrong order. Let's put it back. Here's one way to see it. We could see the text as a scene in itself, It's just pictures in text form. So I decide which scene I want to come first, the text scene or the picture scene. Speaking of narrations, here is one thing I always try to avoid, and that is having the narration text say exactly the same thing as the picture, like this panel for example. The picture already shows him whistling and he's carrying his suitcase, and so it's redundant to say it in the text as well. From the reader's point of view, it's like hearing you say the same thing 2 times. Say the same thing 2 times. Instead, I would rewrite the text like this. This way the text says one part and the pictures say another part, and they work together to tell the full story. It's clearer, it's simpler, nothing redundant. Here are some examples from my own work. As you can see, I let the picture continue the sentence, I don't repeat it. Here the text talks about the artists that have gathered, and they're gonna transform donated pianos. And the picture shows you how they're doing it, with paints, with toolboxes. So the picture contains a different set of information from the text. It expands on the text, it doesn't repeat it. And that's how we want the words and the pictures to work together. Now, since you have watched until this point, I'll now teach you how to control time. In film, I control time by allowing the scene to run for how many seconds I want it to run. But in comics, if I wanted to show a scene where a cat is just strolling along a path, and I wanted that scene to last about 1 second long, I would draw it like this. Because it would take about 1 second for the reader's eye to start from here, process the cat, and reach the other end. But if I want my next scene to be a much shorter scene, like if I want the cat to just look around for a split second, I'll make the size of my panel smaller. And then I'll draw in the cat, his head's turning back. I think the other leg should be in front. With a smaller panel, your eyes will probably now just take half a second to get from one end to the other. Can you sense the difference when you look at these 2 panels? So in comics, we can use space to control time. Or I like to say, in comics, space equals time. And that's why if we add more space between panels, as I mentioned earlier, the pause is longer. If I wanted to now create a much longer scene, or I could say a much slower scene where the cat is just sitting and waiting and maybe thinking, I'll increase the size of the panel. Now let's just draw in the cat. So much space now. And if I try to read it, it'll take about 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. There we go, a longer or slower scene. But let me show you something else. What if I want to make this scene even slower, so the reader spends more time in this panel? I can add more important stuff into this panel, like some dialogue or thoughts. So we give the reader more things to process as they go through this panel. Now it takes about 6 to 8 seconds depending on how fast you read. So maybe we should say space plus stuff equals time in comics. In my story Giggly Floating Fish, I wanted the descent into the tunnels to be slower, so I used a big panel. And when the tension started to ramp up because he got stuck, I used smaller panels to increase the pace. Another page. Things here are moving at a kind of a moderate pace. And then the big reveal, I used a big panel, well actually the whole page, because I wanted the reader to stay in that panel for longer. And as you can see, both the bigger space and the text slow down the scene. Now similar to film, we can frame our pictures and words in each comic panel with either a wide shot, mid shot, or a close-up. Wide shots tell the reader where the story scene takes place, where the characters are, or where a character or object is in relation to other objects in the scene. It mainly answers the question, where? When I do wide shots, I usually can see my character's full body, as well as what is beside them or who is beside them. Like I said, it helps reader know where everything is. Some examples of wide shots, it may be the outside of a building or an interior of a room. A wide shot doesn't mean it has to be in a big panel. It can be in a small panel, it just means we're looking from a further distance from the scene. Mid shots are great for showing what the character is doing with just a portion of the body. It helps answer the question, what? Mid shots help the reader focus in on the more important details of the moment. So if what the character is doing is mostly happening in the top half of the body and the legs are not showing anything important at that moment, I can just show the top half and crop out the rest. So that's the mid shot, and here are some examples. Close-ups are great for showing details that are harder to see from further away, even from a mid-shot, like small details in a facial expression, or another part of the body that can feed the reader with more information about the scene. It can be close-ups of items too. So you may be already familiar with all these different shots, but making all of them work together is where the magic happens. You see, it's very challenging to cram a lot of information into one comic panel, like where the characters are, what each person is doing, showing the expression on each face, and showing all the small details in the scene, especially when comic panels tend to be small. Instead, with comics we can use the wide shots, mid shots, and close-ups as a team to deliver information to the reader in parts, panel by panel. So here is how I do it. I often start with a wide shot because this sets the scene so readers know where my characters are and where all the objects in the scene are. Once the wide shot has been set, I'm free to cut up the scene into mid shots and close-ups. And that's where I can focus in on what each person is doing, what they're saying, and small details that can't be seen from further away. And readers will still relate all these panels to the wide shot panel. If I take away this wide shot, is it clear where the characters are? Not really, right? You can probably only guess. And as a reader, I would feel pretty disorientated pretty quickly, and that makes a pretty frustrating reading experience. So all my shots work together like a team to tell the reader different pieces of information about the scene. For wide shots, it doesn't always need to be in the first panel, but I find it helps to put it near the start of a story scene. I also include a wide shot whenever my character moves to a new location, or when a new character is introduced into a scene, because readers will need to know how near or far that new character is in relation to my other characters. So wide shots are really important. I once hated doing them because it involved drawing backgrounds and more detail, but I just realized I had to train myself to do them. If you really don't want to do a wide shot or don't have the space to draw one out, the alternative is to tell the reader where the characters are in text form, but either show or tell, just one or the other. It'll make things a whole lot clearer for your readers. So these are the things I pay attention to when I do my comics. I hope they'll help you to tell your own stories in your own comics. The best way to learn these principles is to practice them. So start making those comics, and thanks for watching.